Hey everybody, welcome back. We are going to be diving deep today into God's immutability, and we're going to be taking a look at a sermon by Charles Spurgeon.
Yeah, Charles Spurgeon, 19th century Baptist preacher, really interesting, powerful communicator. And he really digs into this concept of immutability, which is such a foundational concept for Christians.
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, it's so interesting to think about because we live in a world where everything is changing all the time. And so to think about something that is unchanging is kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, and it's comforting, right, as a Christian to know that there is that rock, that there is that foundation, that unchanging element when everything else around us is changing so much.
Absolutely. So let's break this down a little bit. When we
Huh.
say God is immutable, what are we really saying about him?
Yeah, immutability means unchanging, unvarying, eternally consistent.
Mm.
So we're saying that God is at his very core, his essence, his character, even his plans are completely consistent throughout eternity.
Okay, that makes sense. And I think, when we start to think about that, then it really starts to have implications on how we view the things that God has promised us, or even the warnings that he's given us.
Yeah, and Spurgeon goes on to talk about how God's immutability covers all of his attributes. So it's not just that his essence is unchanging, but his love, his justice, his faithfulness, all of that is unchanging as well.
Oh, that's good. So, if God's love is unchanging, that means that it's not based on anything we do or how we're feeling. It's constant.
Yeah, exactly. And Spurgeon uses this great illustration. He compares God's promises to notes from the Bank of England. They're guaranteed. They're not going to change just because the market fluctuates or there's a change in policy.
Yeah.
They're backed by the reliability of that bank, and so God's promises are backed by his very nature.
That's a really vivid picture.
Mm.
But I have to say, it's hard sometimes to think about that. When we look around us and everything is changing, even our own bodies and our minds are changing. How can we reconcile those two ideas?
Well, and Spurgeon uses some really vivid imagery here, too. He contrasts the constant nature of God with creation and how creation is always changing. Mountains lose their snow caps, oceans lose water, even the sun needs to be replenished somehow. But God remains the same.
Okay.
He says God is perpetually the same. He is not composed of any substance or material, but is spirit, pure, essential, and ethereal spirit, and therefore he is immutable.
Wow, that's such a powerful statement. And I love how it highlights how different God is from us. We're bound by time, we're bound by physics, but he's not.
Yeah, he's not subject to decay or growth or improvement or decline. He's perfect and he's unchanging.
And that makes me think about us as humans. We're constantly changing and evolving in our beliefs and our bodies, and even our values change.
Yeah.
But God is this fixed point that we can always go back to.
Yeah. And that's where the security and the comfort lie for Christians. Knowing that God is immutable means that his love for us, his plans for us, his promises to us are all rooted in that unchanging nature.
Yeah, absolutely. Spurgeon goes on to talk about God's unchanging plans specifically, and he contrasts that with our plans as humans, which are constantly changing because we have limitations. God doesn't have those limitations.
Yeah, he uses some really strong language, actually, to describe us humans. He calls us worthless atoms of existence, ephemera of the day, creeping insects. And it's all to highlight how different we are from God and how vast that difference is in perspective.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't mincing words, and I'm sure that really got his audience's attention, and it still has that same effect today.
Oh, for sure. Especially today in our world when things are changing so rapidly and so dramatically, to know that God is not going to change his plan is just incredibly reassuring for Christians.
So if God's plans are unchanging, and those plans include the promises he's made to us, then those promises are just as solid.
Yeah, it's like having a guarantee signed by God himself.
That's a good way to put it.
Mhm.
But it makes me also think that immutability, that unchanging nature, it also applies to some of the warnings that God gives. And that's something that Spurgeon doesn't shy away from.
That's right. And he actually quotes scripture here. He says, "He that believeth not shall be damned."
Yeah, that's definitely a powerful statement. And it can be sobering, especially for people who haven't accepted Christ. But you're right. It is important to remember that God's justice is just as unchanging as his love and mercy.
Exactly. And this idea of immutability actually, I think, underscores the urgency of responding to God's grace. It shows us that there really are eternal consequences to rejecting Christ.
It's like a call to action for us to turn away from our sin and to embrace God's salvation.
Absolutely. We can't afford to be complacent or indifferent about our relationship with God, especially when we understand his unchanging nature.
So we've been talking about how God's immutability impacts his promises and his warnings. But what about how it impacts individual Christians? Spurgeon uses this interesting term, the sons of Jacob, to describe the people who really benefit from God's immutability, who are these sons of Jacob.
That's a great question. And it's really interesting how Spurgeon uses that term. He uses it to describe those who have a deep personal relationship with God. They've experienced his love, they've experienced his grace and his faithfulness in a personal way. And he gives different examples of this group. It could be those who are chosen by God for salvation. It could be those who have a special relationship with him through Christ, those who have experienced his presence in a tangible way, those who are facing trials, and those who are marked by faith and a life of prayer.
So it's not just being a Christian in name only, it's about really having a deep relationship with God and knowing him.
Absolutely. And for those sons of Jacob, God's immutability offers them a deep sense of comfort and security because they know that their salvation is secure because it's based on God's unchanging faithfulness, not on their own efforts.
Yeah, that takes a lot of pressure off of us, right? Like our relationship with God doesn't depend on how good we are on any given day.
That's right. And Spurgeon points out that God's immutability actually keeps us from being consumed. And he uses that word in two ways. First of all, eternally in the sense of hell, but also even in this life being consumed by the trials and the temptations that we face.
I love how he uses that personal anecdote about when he was tempted to sin, but God's grace spared him.
Yeah, it's a great example of how God's unchanging love and faithfulness actually protect us and preserve us even when we stumble and fall and mess up.
I think his honesty about his own struggles really makes this concept of immutability feel more real and relatable for us. Even Spurgeon struggled with sin, but God saw him through.
And that's the beauty of this truth. It's not just a theological concept, it's a reality for every Christian.
Now, Spurgeon doesn't just assert that God is immutable. He actually gives some pretty compelling arguments to support this idea. He
Well,
uses logic and reasoning to back it up. So what are some of those arguments?
Yeah, well, he starts by pointing out that the very idea of God, his existence and his being, actually implies immutability. Like, can you imagine an all-powerful, all-knowing God who's also subject to change?
It seems kind of contradictory, right? I mean, like a God who changes implies that there's something lacking in him, something he needs to improve or acquire.
Exactly. Like, it would undermine his sovereignty and even his perfection, because if he was perfect today but changed tomorrow, that would mean he's no longer perfect,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Change in that context would mean that either he's improving or he's getting worse, and both of those contradict the idea of perfection.
And then he also points to the infinity of God. If God is infinite today, but then he changes tomorrow, that would mean that he ceased to be infinite.
Wow, that's just mind-blowing. It just highlights how unique God is and how absolute he is. Like, he encompasses all things, so he can't be subject to those limitations of change.
Yeah, and then Spurgeon goes on to look at history, and he cites all these examples of God's faithfulness to his promises. Throughout time, he points to the downfall of ancient civilizations, like the Philistines, Edom, Babel, Nineveh, as proof that God keeps his decrees.
It's like he's saying, look at history. Can you find one instance where God failed to keep his word or where his plans were thwarted?
Exactly. And he even addresses one story that people often bring up as an example of God changing his mind, and that's the story of Hezekiah's extended lifespan.
Oh, yeah. I remember that story when Isaiah tells Hezekiah that he's going to die. And then Hezekiah prays and God gives him 15 more years. I always wondered if that meant God changed his mind.
Yeah, a lot of people wonder that, but Spurgeon actually argues that God knew all along that Hezekiah would live longer. That initial message was just to prompt Hezekiah to pray and show his faith.
So it's not that God changed his mind. It's that he was working out his purposes through a series of events that we might not always fully understand.
Yeah, and it just shows us that God's ways are so much higher than our ways, and that we don't always see the full picture, but we can trust that he's working everything out according to his perfect plan.
And that's where faith comes in, right? Trusting that even when we don't understand what he's doing, he has our best interests at heart.
Exactly, and that trust is rooted in this truth, that God is unchanging, he is immutable.
As we've been talking, I'm just seeing how this concept of immutability weaves through every aspect of Christian faith. It impacts how we view salvation, God's promises, how we face trials, even how we understand God himself.
It's foundational, isn't it?
It really is.
It's the bedrock of everything that we believe and everything we hope for as Christians.
Well, this deep dive into Spurgeon's sermon has been so enlightening. I know it's challenged me to think more deeply about what God's immutability means for my own life and how I can live in light of that truth.
Me too. It's definitely a concept that we should keep coming back to and let it shape our understanding of God and how we relate to him. And it can be a challenging thought, for people who haven't accepted Christ yet.
Yeah?
Spurgeon doesn't shy away from that. He really emphasizes that. And he even quotes scripture, "He that believeth not shall be damned."
Whoa. Yeah. Strong words there. But,
Yeah.
it's important, I think, to remember that God's justice and judgment are just as unchanging as his love and his mercy.
Exactly. And this immutability of God really highlights the urgency of us responding to his grace. It shows us there are real consequences to rejecting Christ.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that we can't just sit on the sidelines. We have to make a decision.
Absolutely. We can't be complacent or indifferent when it comes to God.
So we've talked about how immutability impacts God's promises and warnings, but what about how it impacts, us as individual Christians? Spurgeon uses this interesting phrase, the sons of Jacob, to describe the people who benefit from God's immutability, who are these sons of Jacob.
Yeah, it's a fascinating phrase, and I think Spurgeon is using it to talk about those who have a deep personal relationship with God. They've experienced his love and his grace and his faithfulness in their lives, and he gives a bunch of examples of who these sons of Jacob might be. It could be those who are chosen by God for salvation, those who have a special relationship with him through Christ, those who have experienced God's presence in a really tangible way, those who are facing trials, and those who are marked by faith and a life of prayer.
So it's not just, being a Christian in name only. It's about really knowing God personally.
Exactly. And for these sons of Jacob, God's immutability offers them a deep sense of comfort and security. They know that their salvation is secure, and that's based on God's faithfulness, not on their own efforts.
Yeah, it really takes the pressure off of us to perform, right?
Yeah,
Because we know that our relationship with God is not based on how good we are on any given day.
that's right. And Spurgeon actually points out that God's immutability keeps us from being consumed. He uses that word in two ways. First of all, eternally, talking about hell, but also, even in this life, being consumed by our trials and the temptations that we face.
And I love how he uses that personal anecdote about a time when he was tempted to sin, but God's grace spared him.
Yeah, it's a great example of how God's unchanging love and faithfulness really do protect us and preserve us even when we mess up and fall.
It just makes it so much more real and relatable to hear that even Spurgeon struggled with sin, but God was faithful.
Yeah, it really shows us that this is not just some abstract theological idea, but it's a reality for every Christian.
Now, Spurgeon doesn't just say God is immutable. He actually gives some pretty convincing arguments to support that idea. What are some of those key arguments that he makes?
Well, he starts off by pointing out that the very idea of God, his existence and his being, actually imply immutability. Can you imagine an all-powerful, all-knowing God who is also subject to change?
It's hard to wrap your mind around that, right? I mean, like if God changes, that implies that there's something he lacks, something he needs to improve on.
Exactly. It would undermine his sovereignty and even his perfection, because if he was perfect today, but he changed tomorrow, that means he's not perfect anymore.
That makes sense. Like change in that context would mean he's either getting better or he's getting worse, and both of those contradict the idea of absolute perfection.
Right. And then he also talks about the infinity of God. If God is infinite today and then he changes tomorrow, that would mean that he stopped being infinite.
Wow, that's like a mind-blowing concept. It just shows you how unique and absolute God is. He encompasses everything, so he can't be subject to those limitations of change.
Yeah, and then Spurgeon goes on to look at history, and he uses all these examples of God's faithfulness to his promises throughout time. He points to the downfall of ancient civilizations like the Philistines, Edom, Babel, Nineveh, as proof that God keeps his decrees.
It's like he's saying, look at history. Can you find one instance where God failed to keep his word or where his plans were thwarted?
Exactly. And he even addresses a story that people often bring up as an example of God changing his mind. And that's the story of Hezekiah when he gets his lifespan extended.
Oh, yeah. I remember that story when the prophet Isaiah told Hezekiah he was going to die, and then he prayed, and God gave him 15 more years. I always wondered, did God change his mind there?
Yeah, it's a common question, but Spurgeon actually argues that God knew all along that Hezekiah would live longer. That initial message was really just to prompt Hezekiah to pray and demonstrate his faith.
So it's not so much that God changed his mind, it's that he's working out his purposes through a series of events that, from our limited perspective, might seem confusing.
Yeah, and it just highlights the fact that God's ways are higher than our ways. We don't always see the full picture, but we can trust that he's working everything out according to his perfect plan.
And that's where faith comes in, right?
Yeah,
Trusting that even when we don't understand, he's got it all under control.
absolutely. And that trust is rooted in this truth of God's immutability.
As we've been talking, I'm just realizing how this concept of immutability really does touch every aspect of the Christian faith. It impacts how we understand salvation, how we view God's promises, how we face trials, even how we understand God himself.
It's a foundational truth for sure.
It really is.
It's the bedrock of everything that we believe as Christians and everything that we hope for.
Well, this deep dive into Spurgeon's sermon has been so enlightening. I know it's really challenged me to think more deeply about what God's immutability means for me and how I can live my life in light of that truth.
Me too. Definitely a concept that we should keep coming back to and let it shape our understanding of God and our relationship with Him.
If we've been talking about this, I just keep thinking about how much comfort and security this truth offers,
Mm.
in a world that feels like it's changing faster and faster.
It's an anchor, right? It's a sure foundation when everything else feels like it's shifting beneath our feet.
It is. And, it makes me think about how we as humans try to find stability in things that are always changing. Our jobs, our relationships, possessions, even our own feelings. And inevitably, those things are going to let us down.
Yeah, we look for security in all the wrong places, but God's immutability that offers a different kind of security. It's rooted in His character and His faithfulness, and that doesn't change.
That's really, I think, what sets Christianity apart. It's not based on wishful thinking or just blind faith. It's based on this God who is unchanging, eternally the same.
Exactly, and that changes everything about how we relate to Him. It means that His love for us is not based on how well we're doing or how we're feeling. It means His promises are good, they're solid, and it means His plan for us, even when we can't see it, is being worked out according to His perfect will.
I'm also thinking about how this truth of God's immutability challenges us to live differently. If God doesn't change and He calls us to be more like Him, then that means we need to strive for consistency and integrity in our own lives.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not just about finding comfort in God's unchanging nature, but it's also about letting that truth transform us. If we're rooted in Him, then we should reflect His character. We should be known for our steadfastness, our reliability, our commitment to truth.
Yeah, it makes me think about how often we as Christians can be kind of flaky. Our
Mm-hmm.
passions can be fleeting, our commitments can waver, but we really understand this idea of God's immutability. It should change how we approach everything in our lives, our relationships, our work, even our spiritual disciplines.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just a theological concept that we talk about, in Bible studies or whatever. This is a truth that should impact every area of our lives. It's the lens that we should view the world through, the compass that guides our decisions, the anchor that keeps us steady in the storms.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm just left with a sense of awe at the unchanging nature of God. It's both humbling and empowering. It reminds us that we're not in control, but we're also in good hands.
It's a beautiful paradox, isn't it? That the God who is infinitely above us beyond our comprehension is also the God who is completely reliable. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that's where we find our hope and our security.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation, and thank you so much for helping us unpack this truth.
It's been my pleasure.
And for all of you listening out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into God's Word. And we encourage you to keep seeking and keep exploring the amazing truths that are found there. Until next time, grace and peace to you.